The gunshot echoed through the saloon as Gwendolyn Torres grabbed the pistol from the drunk cowboy's hand. Her worn cream-colored dress dusted with trail dirt, and the hem torn from weeks of hard travel across the Arizona territory. It was late summer in 1878, and Apache Junction had become a haven for drifters, outlaws, and those seeking to disappear into the unforgiving landscape where the Superstition Mountains loomed like ancient sentinels. Gwendolyn had arrived 3 days prior on a supply wagon, her belongings nothing more than a small carpetbag and the dress on her back, once white, but now the color of old parchment, faded from sun and hardship. The man whose weapon she now held blinked at her in confusion, his alcohol-soaked brain struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Gwendolyn's heart pounded in her chest, but her hand remained steady. She had learned long ago that showing fear only invited more trouble. "That is enough," she said firmly, her voice carrying a slight accent from her upbringing in Santa Fe. "You nearly shot that man over a card game." The bartender, a portly man named Frank, wiped his hands on his apron and nodded gratefully at Gwendolyn. The drunk cowboy swayed on his feet, looking between his empty hand and the young woman who had somehow disarmed him. It was in that moment that Deputy Marshal Drake Brennan pushed through the saloon doors, his hand instinctively moving to his own weapon as he assessed the situation. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, took in the scene with practiced efficiency. The overturned poker table, the frightened gamblers pressed against the far wall, and most notably, the young woman in the faded dress holding a pistol with surprising competence. "I will take that, miss," Drake said, his voice calm but authoritative as he approached. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that touched his collar. A deputy marshal's badge gleamed on his vest. Gwendolyn carefully handed him the weapon, barrel pointed down, and Drake found himself momentarily distracted by the intelligence in her dark brown eyes and the quiet strength evident in her bearing despite her disheveled appearance. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. "That took courage." "It took necessity," Gwendolyn replied. "Courage would imply I had a choice." Drake secured the drunk man, guiding him toward the door with a firm grip on his arm. "You will sleep this off in a cell," he told him. Then he glanced back at Gwendolyn. "I would like to speak with you once I have him settled, if you do not mind." Gwendolyn nodded, suddenly aware of how her heart had started racing again, though this time for an entirely different reason. There was something about the deputy marshal that made her feel both unsettled and oddly safe at the same time. 20 minutes later, Drake returned to find Gwendolyn sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee Frank had provided free of charge. Drake bought himself a cup and asked if he might join her. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I am Drake Brennan," he said, settling into the seat, "deputy marshal for this territory." "Gwendolyn Torres," she replied, "though most people call me Gwen." "Where did you learn to handle a weapon like that, Miss Torres?" Gwendolyn wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, drawing comfort from its heat despite the sweltering Arizona afternoon outside. "My father was a rancher. He believed his daughters should know how to protect themselves. The territory can be unforgiving, especially to women. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." The past tense hung in the air between them. "He died 2 years ago. Yellow fever swept through our town." "I am sorry for your loss," Drake said, and she could hear the genuine sympathy in his voice. "Is that why you came to Apache Junction?" Gwendolyn studied him carefully, trying to determine how much to reveal. There was something about Drake Brennan that inspired trust, but she had learned to be cautious. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. My father's ranch was sold to pay debts after he died, My mother passed when I was young, and I have no other family. Drake nodded slowly, understanding the reality of her situation. The frontier was full of stories like hers, people displaced by death, debt, or desperation. What were you planning to do here? Find work, I suppose. I can cook, clean, handle horses, and keep accounts. I am literate and can cipher. Surely someone in town needs help. The schoolhouse needs a teacher, Drake said. Old Mrs. Henderson passed last month and they have been searching for a replacement. The pay is not much, but it comes with a small cottage behind the schoolhouse. Gwendolyn's eyes widened slightly. I have no formal training as a teacher. Can you read and write? Do you know arithmetic, history, geography? Yes, my father ensured I was well educated. Then you know more than most folks around here. The children need someone, Miss Torres. The town council has been worried that without a school, families will move elsewhere. It was an opportunity Gwendolyn had not dared hope for. How would I apply for such a position? I am on the town council, Drake said with a slight smile. And after what I just witnessed, I think you would do fine with a room full of children. If you are interested, I can arrange for you to meet with the other council members tomorrow. I am very interested, Marshal Brennan. Thank you, Drake, he corrected gently. And you are welcome. They talked for another hour, and Gwendolyn found herself relaxing in Drake's company. He told her about Apache Junction, how it had grown from a small mining camp into a proper town over the past decade. He had been deputy marshal for 3 years, having come west from Missouri after serving in the cavalry. He was 26 years old, had never married, and seemed genuinely dedicated to bringing order to this wild corner of the Arizona Territory. In turn, Gwendolyn shared more about her life in Santa Fe, her childhood on the ranch, and her journey to Apache Junction. She was 23 and had spent the past 2 years working as a seamstress for a wealthy family, saving every penny she could until she had enough to leave and start fresh somewhere new. Why leave Santa Fe? Drake asked. Surely you could have found steady work there. Gwendolyn hesitated, then decided on honesty. The eldest son of the family I worked for became insistent in his attentions. When I refused him, he became angry. His mother, my employer, suggested I was encouraging him. It became clear I needed to leave. Drake's jaw tightened. Did he hurt you? He tried. I managed to lock myself in my room and left the next morning before the household woke. I am sorry you went through that, Drake said quietly. For what it is worth, you are safe here. I give you my word. The sincerity in his voice made Gwendolyn's chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. She had been alone for so long, fighting her own battles, that having someone offer protection and kindness felt almost foreign. The next day, Drake arranged for Gwendolyn to meet with the town council in the small building that served as both courthouse and town hall. The council consisted of Drake, the banker Mr. Patterson, the general store owner Mrs. Chen, the local Dr. Marcus Thornton, and the owner of the largest ranch in the area, a gruff man named William Grant. Gwendolyn wore her faded dress, having no other option, but she had washed it as best she could in her hotel room and mended the torn hem. She stood before the council with her back straight and her head high, refusing to show the nervousness that fluttered in her stomach. Mrs. Chen, a practical woman in her 50s who had immigrated from China 20 years earlier, asked most of the questions. Gwendolyn answered each one honestly, demonstrating her knowledge and her dedication to education. When Mrs. Chen asked her to read a passage from a schoolbook and then solve several arithmetic problems on a chalkboard, Gwendolyn completed both tasks without error. The dress, Mr. Grant said suddenly, his gruff voice cutting through the proceedings. Begging your pardon, Miss Torres, but that dress has seen better days. How do you expect to command respect from the children looking like a pauper?" Gwendolyn felt her cheeks flush with shame, but she kept her voice steady. "I have funds to purchase fabric, sir. I am skilled with a needle and can make myself appropriate clothing for teaching. I simply have not had the opportunity since arriving in town." "The question is inappropriate, Mrs. Chen said sharply, glaring at Grant. "Miss Torres has demonstrated more than adequate qualifications for the position. Her clothing situation is temporary and easily remedied." Dr. Thornton, a kind-faced man in his 40s, nodded in agreement. "I move that we offer Miss Torres the position of schoolteacher, along with use of the cottage, at a salary of $30 per month." "I second the motion," Drake said immediately. The vote was unanimous, despite Mr. Grant's obvious reluctance. Gwendolyn felt relief wash over her so intensely she had to grip the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise I will not disappoint you." After the meeting, Mrs. Chen walked with Gwendolyn to her general store. "I have some fabric that will suit you well," she said. "Good quality cotton and a nice dark blue wool for winter. I will give you a fair price." "You are very kind, Mrs. Chen." "I am practical," the older woman corrected, but her eyes were warm. "This town needs a teacher and you need a fresh start. Besides, I like you. You have steel in your spine. You will need it, working with some of these wild children." Over the next week, Gwendolyn settled into the cottage behind the schoolhouse. It was small but clean, with a bedroom, a main room that served as both kitchen and sitting area, and a small porch. Drake helped her move her few belongings from the hotel, and various townspeople donated items she would need. A table and chairs from the hotel owner who was replacing his furniture, dishes and pots from Mrs. Chen, linens from the doctor's wife, and a rocking chair from the blacksmith whose wife had passed and who had no use for it anymore. Drake found himself stopping by more often than strictly necessary, always with some excuse about town business or checking on the schoolhouse. The truth was, he found himself drawn to Gwendolyn in a way he had never experienced before. She was beautiful, certainly, with her dark hair and expressive eyes, but it was more than that. There was a quiet strength to her, a resilience that spoke of someone who had faced hardship and emerged unbroken. Gwendolyn was equally drawn to Drake, though she tried to convince herself it was merely gratitude. But gratitude did not explain the way her heart sped up when she heard his voice, or the way she found herself watching for him through the schoolhouse windows, or the warmth that spread through her chest when he smiled at her. One evening, a week before school was set to begin, Drake arrived at her cottage with a large bundle wrapped in brown paper. "What is this?" Gwendolyn asked, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been cooking supper, and the small cottage smelled pleasantly of beans and cornbread. "Open it," Drake said, looking almost shy. Gwendolyn carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a beautiful dress in a deep emerald green. The fabric was quality cotton, the stitching perfect, with a modest neckline and long sleeves appropriate for a schoolteacher. "Drake, I cannot accept this," she said, though her hands trembled as she held the dress. "It is too much." "Mrs. Chen made it," Drake said quickly. "She took measurements from your old dress and wanted to make you something nice for the first day of school. The town council paid for it as a welcoming gift. It is from all of us, not just me." Gwendolyn suspected this was not entirely true, but she did not challenge him. "It is beautiful. Please tell Mrs. Chen and the council how grateful I am." "There is something else," Drake said, pulling a smaller package from his pocket. "This one is from me specifically." Inside was a lovely tortoiseshell hair comb, simple but elegant. Gwendolyn looked up at Drake with tears in her eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked softly. Drake stepped closer, his expression serious. Because I have never met anyone quite like you, Gwendolyn Torres. Because you walked into that saloon alone and scared, but you stood your ground anyway. Because you lost everything, but you did not let it break you. Because when you smile, which is not often enough, it is like the sun coming out from behind clouds. Gwendolyn's breath caught in her throat. Drake, I know it is too soon, he said quickly. I know you just got here and you are just starting to build a new life. I am not asking for anything, Gwendolyn. I just wanted you to know that you are special to me. Before she could think better of it, Gwendolyn rose on her toes and kissed his cheek. You are special to me too, she whispered. Drake's hand came up to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. For a moment they stood frozen, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Drake stepped back, clearing his throat. I should go, he said, his voice rougher than usual. You have supper cooking, and I have evening rounds to make. After he left, Gwendolyn held the hair comb and the new dress and let herself cry for the first time since leaving Santa Fe. But these were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of hope, of possibility, of the strange and wonderful feeling of being seen and valued by someone like Drake Brennan. School began on a Monday morning in September. Gwendolyn wore her new green dress and the hair comb, and she stood at the schoolhouse door to greet each student as they arrived. There were 15 children in total, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Some came from town, others from the surrounding ranches, arriving on horseback or in wagons driven by parents who looked Gwendolyn over with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. The first day was chaos. The older boys, particularly a pair of 13-year-old twins named Jack and James Morrison, tested her immediately, talking during lessons and disrupting the younger children. Gwendolyn handled it with a firm voice and clear consequences, making the twins write lines during their lunch break. By the end of the week, she had established order. The children learned quickly that Miss Torres was fair but strict, that she made lessons interesting, and that she genuinely cared about their learning. She praised effort and improvement, helped struggling students after school hours, and challenged the advanced learners with extra work. Drake made a habit of walking past the schoolhouse during the day, often timing his rounds to coincide with the children's recess. He would lean against the fence and watch Gwendolyn organizing games or settling disputes, admiring the way she interacted with the children. Sometimes she would catch his eye and smile, and Drake felt his heart perform an acrobatic feat in his chest. On Sundays, the town held church services in the same building used for town meetings, led by a circuit preacher who rotated between several settlements. Drake began sitting with Gwendolyn, and the town's gossips noticed immediately. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, whispered to Mrs. Grant that it was about time Deputy Brennan found himself a good woman. Mrs. Chen simply smiled knowingly when she saw them together. As autumn deepened and the Arizona heat finally broke, Drake and Gwendolyn spent more time together outside of polite town interaction. He taught her to ride better, taking her out on his day off to explore the beautiful red rock formations surrounding Apache Junction. She cooked him dinner at her cottage, and they would sit on her small porch talking until the stars came out. One evening in late October, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple, Drake reached over and took Gwendolyn's hand. I have been thinking, he said, his voice uncertain in a way that was unlike him. About us. About what this is between us. Gwendolyn's heart pounded. What is it, do you think? I think I am falling in love with you, Drake said simply, turning to face her. Actually, that is not quite true. I think I fell in love with you the moment you disarmed that drunk cowboy in the saloon. Everything since then has just been me falling deeper." Gwendolyn felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I tried not to. I told myself it was too soon, that I needed to focus on building my life here, but I love you, Drake Brennan." Drake cupped her face in both hands and kissed her gently, reverently, as if she were something precious and fragile. Gwendolyn kissed him back, pouring all her hope and love and trust into that connection. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Drake rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, but Gwendolyn, I am 26 years old and I have never felt this way about anyone. I do not want to waste time courting for months when I already know you are the only woman I want to spend my life with." "Yes," Gwendolyn said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They decided on a wedding date in December, after the school term broke for winter holiday. This gave them 2 months to prepare, which seemed both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. The town buzzed with excitement over the news. Mrs. Chen immediately began planning what she called a proper celebration, despite Gwendolyn's protests that they wanted something simple. "Nonsense, Mrs. Chen said firmly. "This town needs something to celebrate, and you two deserve a real wedding. Let us old folks have our fun, girl." The biggest question was Gwendolyn's dress. She had no money for a traditional wedding gown, and while she could make her own clothing, something as special as a wedding dress felt beyond her skills. "What about your white dress?" Drake asked one evening. "The one you wore when you arrived." Gwendolyn shook her head. "It is too damaged, too faded. It was white once long ago, but now it is just worn. It tells the story of everything I have been through, all the hardship. I cannot wear that to marry you." "I think it is beautiful," Drake said quietly. "It tells the story of a woman who survived, who kept going even when things were hard. But I understand if you want something new." A week later, Mrs. Chen pulled Gwendolyn aside at the general store. "I have been thinking about your wedding dress," she said. "Would you let me try something? I have an idea, but I need your permission and your old dress." Curious and touched by Mrs. Chen's interest, Gwendolyn agreed. She brought the faded dress to the general store the next day, and Mrs. Chen disappeared into her back room with it. She refused to let Gwendolyn see what she was doing, only promising that she would not ruin it. Meanwhile, Drake was busy with his own preparations. He had been saving money for years, living simply in the rooms above the marshal's office. Now he began looking for a proper house for himself and Gwendolyn. There was a small cottage on the edge of town, with a bedroom, a kitchen, a sitting room, and a good-sized porch. It had a small barn and corral, room for a horse or two, and perhaps eventually a cow. The owner, an elderly miner who was moving to Tucson to live with his daughter, was willing to sell it for a fair price. Drake bought the house without telling Gwendolyn, planning to surprise her with it after the wedding. He spent his free time fixing it up, repairing loose boards, replacing a broken window, painting the interior walls. Several townspeople helped him, understanding that a newly married couple needed a proper home. As December approached, the excitement in Apache Junction grew. It had been a hard year for the small town, with a dry summer affecting the ranchers and 2 children dying of influenza in the spring. The upcoming wedding felt like a fresh start, a celebration of hope and love in a harsh land. Dr. Thornton's wife, Margaret, organized a quilting bee to make a wedding quilt for the couple. Even women who barely knew Gwendolyn contributed squares, understanding that this wedding belonged to the whole community. The quilt was beautiful, done in shades of blue and cream, with each square containing a different pattern. The Morrison twins, who had become devoted students under Gwendolyn's teaching, asked their father to build a special gift. Under his supervision, they crafted a beautiful wooden chest with brass hinges and a carved lid showing the Superstition Mountains. It was meant to hold linens or keepsakes, and the boys presented it to Gwendolyn with shy pride 2 weeks before the wedding. The day before the ceremony, Mrs. Chen finally revealed her work on the wedding dress. She had taken Gwendolyn's old faded dress and transformed it completely. The fabric had been carefully washed, treated with a special mixture that brightened and set the fibers, and then dyed using techniques Mrs. Chen had learned in her homeland. The dress was now a soft, lovely cream color, no longer stark white but not the dirty beige it had been. Mrs. Chen had taken it apart completely and reconstructed it, adding lace from her own wedding dress at the collar and cuffs, taking in the seams to fit Gwendolyn's figure perfectly, and creating a beautiful overlay for the skirt using sheer fabric embroidered with delicate flowers. When Gwendolyn saw it, she burst into tears. "Mrs. Chen, it is beautiful. How did you?" "Old Chinese techniques," Mrs. Chen said, looking pleased with Gwendolyn's reaction. "My mother taught me. The dress tells your story, yes. It has been with you through hardship. But now it is renewed, ready for a new chapter, just like you." "I cannot believe you did this for me," Gwendolyn said, touching the delicate embroidery with reverent fingers. "You are a good girl," Mrs. Chen said simply. "You work hard, you care for the children, you make Drake happy. This is a small thing." That evening, Gwendolyn tried on the dress one final time in her cottage. She stood before her small mirror, the tortoiseshell comb Drake had given her holding back her hair, and looked at her reflection. The dress was beautiful, but more than that, it felt right. It was not a pristine white gown that pretended she was an innocent young girl with no past. It was a dress that had been through struggle and had come out lovelier for it. She thought about what she would say to Drake during their vows, about the life they would build together. She thought about how far she had come from that desperate young woman who had fled Santa Fe with nothing but a carpet bag and a faded dress. She thought about the future stretching before her, full of possibility. "I never thought I would wear white," she whispered to her reflection, thinking about all the things that had happened to her, all the ways she had been told she was less than she should be. But here she was, about to marry a good man who loved her, wearing a dress that told her story. The wedding was held on a Sunday morning in mid-December. The weather cooperated beautifully, providing one of those perfect Arizona winter days where the sky was impossibly blue and the air was crisp, but not cold. The ceremony was held outdoors in the town square, which had been decorated with pine boughs and winter wildflowers. The entire town attended. Chairs had been borrowed from every building in Apache Junction and arranged in rows facing a simple arch that the blacksmith had constructed and that local children had decorated with greenery and ribbons. The circuit preacher, Reverend Walsh, had arranged his schedule specifically to be present for the ceremony. Drake stood under the arch wearing his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his hands clasped in front of him to hide their slight trembling. Dr. Thornton stood beside him as his best man. Drake's eyes were fixed on the schoolhouse, where Gwendolyn was preparing with Mrs. Chen and Margaret Thornton. The fiddle player from the saloon, a man named Timothy who was respectably sober and dressed in his Sunday clothes, began to play a simple but beautiful melody. The guests rose to their feet and turned toward the schoolhouse. Gwendolyn emerged on the arm of Mr. Patterson, the banker, who had volunteered to walk her down the aisle since she had no family to perform the duty. She moved slowly, wanting to remember every detail of this moment. She saw the decorated arch, the gathered townspeople, the beautiful winter sky. But mostly she saw Drake, standing tall and handsome, watching her with such love in his eyes that she felt tears threaten. The dress moved around her like a dream, the cream fabric catching the sunlight, the delicate embroidered overlay swaying gently. She felt beautiful and whole and ready for this new chapter. When she reached the arch, Mr. Patterson placed her hand in Drake's and stepped back. Drake's fingers wrapped around hers, warm and strong and steady. Reverend Walsh began the ceremony with a prayer, then spoke about love and commitment and partnership. But Gwendolyn barely heard him. She was lost in Drake's eyes, in the wonder of this moment, in the knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Drake Brennan," Reverend Walsh said, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Drake said clearly, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "With all my heart I do." "Gwendolyn Torres, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Gwendolyn said, her voice strong despite the tears on her cheeks. "Always." They exchanged simple gold bands that Drake had ordered from a jeweler in Phoenix. When Drake slipped the ring onto Gwendolyn's finger, his hand was shaking slightly, and she covered it with her own, steadying him, telling him without words that they would steady each other now. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Walsh said with a smile, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Drake, you may kiss your bride." Drake cupped Gwendolyn's face tenderly and kissed her softly, sweetly, in front of the entire town. The guests erupted in applause and cheers, and when Drake and Gwendolyn finally broke apart, both were laughing and crying at the same time. They walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife, hands clasped tightly. The townspeople threw rice and wildflower petals, and children ran alongside them calling congratulations. The celebration continued at the town hall, which had been transformed for the reception. Long tables held food that the townspeople had contributed: roasted meats, fresh bread, vegetables preserved from the harvest, cakes and pies and cookies. Someone had even managed to obtain several bottles of champagne from Phoenix, an extravagance that made Gwendolyn gasp. Drake and Gwendolyn moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and thanks from seemingly everyone in Apache Junction. Gwendolyn was hugged by women she barely knew. Her students gave her wildflowers they had picked that morning, and the Morrison twins presented her with a roughly drawn picture of her and Drake standing together, which she promised to treasure forever. As the afternoon wore on and shadows lengthened, Timothy the fiddle player was joined by a guitar player and a man with a harmonica. They struck up a lively tune and dancing began. Drake led Gwendolyn out for the first dance, holding her close as they swayed together. "Have I told you how beautiful you look today?" Drake murmured into her ear. "Only about 20 times," Gwendolyn said with a laugh. "That dress," Drake said, pulling back to look at her. "It is perfect. You are perfect." "I am not perfect," Gwendolyn said softly. "I am just someone who kept going, who survived long enough to find you." "When you came out wearing that dress," Drake said, "I thought about what you said before, about never thinking you would wear white. Gwendolyn, you deserve every good thing. You deserve this dress, this day, this happiness. And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." Gwendolyn kissed him, not caring that they were in the middle of the dance floor, that the whole town was watching. "I love you," she said against his lips. "I love you too," Drake replied. "My wife." They danced until the sun set, until the hall was lit with lanterns and candles, until Gwendolyn's feet ached in her borrowed shoes. Finally, as the party showed no signs of winding down, Drake leaned close and whispered, "Ready to see your wedding present?" Gwendolyn looked up at him in surprise. "You got me a wedding present. Drake, you have already given me so much. This is special," he promised. "Come with me." They slipped away from the celebration, walking hand in hand through the quiet streets of Apache Junction. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. Drake led her to the edge of town, to the small cottage she had never paid much attention to before. "Drake, what are we doing here?" Drake pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the front door, then scooped Gwendolyn up in his arms. She laughed in surprise as he carried her over the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan," he said, setting her down gently in the main room. Gwendolyn looked around in wonder. The cottage was small but beautifully appointed. Someone, clearly Drake with help from townspeople, had furnished it with care. There was a comfortable sofa and chairs in the sitting room, a dining table with 4 chairs, a kitchen area with a new stove and dishes neatly arranged on shelves. Through an open doorway, she could see a bedroom with a large bed, covered with the quilt the women had made, and curtains at the windows. "You bought us a house," Gwendolyn breathed, turning to look at Drake with wide eyes. "I have been saving for years," Drake explained. "I always hoped I would find someone to share a life with, so I put away money. When I met you, I knew. I wanted to give you a real home, Gwendolyn. Not just a cottage behind the schoolhouse, but something that is ours." Gwendolyn threw her arms around Drake's neck, laughing and crying simultaneously. "It is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe this is my life now." Drake kissed her deeply, his hands sliding into her hair, carefully avoiding the tortoiseshell comb. "Believe it," he said. "This is real, we are real, and we have forever ahead of us." They spent their wedding night in their new home, learning each other with tenderness and passion, whispering promises and dreams in the darkness. Gwendolyn had never felt safer, more cherished, more completely loved than she did wrapped in Drake's arms in their marriage bed. The next morning, they woke tangled together as golden sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows. Drake traced patterns on Gwendolyn's bare shoulder, marveling at the fact that she was his wife, that this was his life now. "What are you thinking?" Gwendolyn asked sleepily. "That I am the luckiest man in the Arizona Territory," Drake said. "That I cannot wait to spend every morning for the rest of my life waking up next to you." They stayed in bed longer than was strictly proper, talking and laughing and making love again with the unhurried leisure of people who had nowhere else to be. Eventually, hunger drove them to the kitchen, where Gwendolyn made breakfast while Drake watched her with open adoration. "You are going to get tired of me very quickly if you keep staring at me like that," Gwendolyn said, amused. "Never," Drake said firmly. "I plan to stare at you exactly this way for at least the next 60 years. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding." Gwendolyn continued teaching, and Drake continued his work as deputy marshal. But now, they came home to each other every evening, sharing meals and conversation and the comfortable intimacy of married life. Gwendolyn proved to be an excellent homemaker despite her limited resources. She planted a winter garden behind the cottage with seeds Mrs. Chen provided, and by February they had fresh greens to supplement their meals. She sewed curtains for all the windows, made cushions for the chairs, and slowly transformed the cottage into a true home. Drake, for his part, threw himself into making the property secure and comfortable. He repaired the corral fence, built a chicken coop and purchased 6 laying hens, and began the process of acquiring a milk cow. He also continued his work as deputy marshal with renewed dedication, knowing that the safety and stability of Apache Junction directly affected his wife's well-being and happiness. The townspeople quickly became accustomed to seeing Deputy Marshal Brennan and his wife around town. They were often seen together on Sundays after church, walking arm in arm, or sitting on their porch in the evenings watching the sunset over the mountains. They became known as a couple deeply in love, and their obvious happiness was a source of joy to many who had witnessed their courtship and marriage. Winter gave way to spring, and Gwendolyn's garden flourished in the warm Arizona sun. She taught her students about botany and mathematics by having them help measure and plant a small garden beside the schoolhouse. The children loved the practical application of their lessons, and several parents commented on how much their children were learning under Miss Torres's instruction, though they still called her that despite her married name being Mrs. Brennan. In early April, Gwendolyn woke feeling queasy for the third morning in a row. She lay quietly beside Drake, her hand on her belly, wondering if it could be possible. She had missed her monthly courses, but she had been irregular before and had not wanted to get her hopes up. That afternoon, she visited Dr. Thornton's office, claiming a minor ailment. Margaret Thornton, who assisted her husband, immediately guessed the real reason for the visit and ushered Gwendolyn into a private examining room. After a thorough examination, Dr. Thornton smiled at Gwendolyn warmly. "Congratulations, Mrs. Brennan. I would estimate you are about 2 months along. The baby should arrive sometime in early November." Gwendolyn felt joy and terror in equal measure. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without divine intervention," Dr. Thornton said kindly. "How do you feel about this news?" "Happy," Gwendolyn said immediately, "and scared. What if something goes wrong? What if I cannot be a good mother?" Margaret Thornton took Gwendolyn's hand. "You are going to be a wonderful mother. I have watched you with the schoolchildren. You are patient and kind and firm when necessary. Those are the exact qualities a child needs." Gwendolyn walked home in a daze, her hand pressed to her still flat stomach. She was going to have a baby. She and Drake were going to be parents. The magnitude of it felt overwhelming. That evening she made Drake's favorite meal and waited for the right moment to tell him. But Drake was unusually quiet during dinner, pushing food around his plate distractedly. "What is wrong?" Gwendolyn finally asked. Drake looked up, seeming surprised. "Nothing is wrong. Why do you ask?" "You have barely touched your food, and you have been quiet all evening. Did something happen today?" Drake set down his fork and reached across the table to take Gwendolyn's hand. "Marshal Yates is retiring," he said. "He is moving back east to be near his daughter. The territorial governor is appointing a new marshal for this region." "Who is he appointing?" "Me," Drake said, looking both proud and uncertain. "The governor sent word today. I am being promoted to marshal. It means more responsibility, more territory to cover, but also better pay and more authority to really make a difference here." "Drake, that is wonderful," Gwendolyn exclaimed. "Why do you not look happy about it?" "I am happy, but I am also worried. It means I will be gone more, traveling to the other settlements in the region. I do not want to leave you alone so much." Gwendolyn squeezed his hand. "I will be fine, and this news makes my news even more timely." "Your news?" Gwendolyn took a deep breath. "I saw Dr. Thornton today." "Drake, I am expecting. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Drake simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a huge smile spread across his face, and he jumped up from his chair so quickly it fell over backwards. He pulled Gwendolyn to her feet and spun her around, laughing. "We are having a baby," he said, setting her down carefully as if she were suddenly made of glass. "Gwendolyn, that is incredible. When are you feeling well?" "What did the doctor say?" "Early November. I feel fine aside from morning sickness and doctor." "Thornton says everything looks normal," Gwendolyn said, laughing at his enthusiasm. "You are happy then?" "Happy," Drake cupped her face in his hands. "Gwendolyn, I am beyond happy, I am. There are not even words. You are going to be a mother, I am going to be a father, we made a child together." That night, they lay in bed talking about the future, about names and nurseries, and whether the baby would have Drake's gray eyes or Gwendolyn's brown ones. Drake kept his hand on Gwendolyn's stomach, marveling at the life growing there even though there was no visible sign yet. "Are you scared?" Drake asked quietly in the darkness. "Terrified," Gwendolyn admitted, "but also excited. Is that normal?" "I think so. I am scared too. What if I am not a good father? What if I cannot protect you both?" Gwendolyn turned in his arms to face him. "You are going to be an amazing father. I have seen you with the children in town. You are patient and kind and strong. Our child will be lucky to have you." "We will figure it out together," Drake said, kissing her forehead. "Everything we do together." Over the next few months, Apache Junction buzzed with excitement over the double news of Drake's promotion and the expected baby. Mrs. Chen immediately began knitting tiny clothes in soft yellows and greens. Margaret Thornton offered advice about pregnancy and childbirth, helping to ease some of Gwendolyn's fears. The Morrison twins and other students at the school began making gifts for the baby. Everything from carved wooden toys to drawings meant to decorate the nursery. Gwendolyn continued teaching through the spring, though she tired more easily as the pregnancy progressed. Drake, now Marshal Brennan, tried to limit his travel as much as possible, but his new responsibilities meant he was sometimes gone for days at a time, riding between Apache Junction and the other settlements in his jurisdiction. Whenever he returned home, he would burst through the door calling for Gwendolyn, needing to see for himself that she was well. He would pull her into his arms, his hands immediately going to her growing belly, and tell her about everything that had happened while he was gone. Gwendolyn would make him supper and listen to his stories, and then they would sit on the porch together, Drake's hand on her stomach, feeling their child move and kick. "Strong kicks," Drake said one evening in late June, his palm pressed against a particularly vigorous movement. "This baby is going to be a fighter like the mother." "Or stubborn like the father," Gwendolyn teased. By July, Gwendolyn was obviously pregnant, her body changing in ways that still amazed her. She finished the school term at the end of May and spent the summer preparing for the baby. Drake converted the small spare room in their cottage into a nursery, building a cradle with his own hands and painting the walls a soft cream color. The rocking chair from the blacksmith was moved into the nursery, and Gwendolyn spent hours sitting in it, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, imagining holding her child in this very chair. The quilt from the quilting bee would go in the cradle, she decided, a reminder of the community that had welcomed her and helped her build this life. In August, Gwendolyn's body grew uncomfortable. The Arizona summer heat was oppressive, and her swollen belly made movement difficult. Drake worried constantly, but Gwendolyn remained in good spirits despite the discomfort. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him when he fretted. "I am strong, and Dr. Thornton says everything is progressing normally." "I just wish I could do something to help," Drake said, gently rubbing her swollen feet as she reclined on the sofa. "You are helping," Gwendolyn assured him. "You are here, you love me, and you are going to be here when the baby comes. That is everything." September brought relief from the worst of the heat, and Gwendolyn found she could move more comfortably again. She and Margaret Thornton became close friends during this time, with Margaret visiting often to check on Gwendolyn and provide companionship. Margaret had 3 grown children of her own and was happy to share her experience and wisdom. In late October, as Gwendolyn's due date approached, Drake became increasingly anxious. He had arranged for one of the other deputies to cover his territory so he would not have to travel, and he barely let Gwendolyn out of his sight. "You are hovering," Gwendolyn told him one afternoon, amused despite her own nervousness about the approaching birth. "I am being attentive," Drake corrected. "You followed me to the clothesline this morning. You looked like you were having trouble with that heavy basket." "Drake," Gwendolyn said gently, taking his hand, "I love you, but you need to relax. The baby will come when the baby is ready, and worrying yourself into an early grave will not help any of us." Drake pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her large belly. "I am just scared," he admitted quietly. "Childbirth is dangerous. I cannot lose you, Gwendolyn, I cannot." "You are not going to lose me," Gwendolyn said firmly. "I am strong, Dr. Thornton is experienced, and Margaret will be there to help. Everything is going to be fine." The baby came on a cool November morning, 3 days past the date Dr. Thornton had estimated. Gwendolyn woke before dawn with contractions that she initially thought were the false ones she had been experiencing for weeks. But these grew stronger and more regular, and by the time the sun rose, she was certain this was the real thing. Drake sent for Dr. Thornton and Margaret immediately. He tried to hide his terror, but his hands shook as he helped Gwendolyn through the contractions. Margaret arrived first and took over with calm efficiency, sending Drake to heat water and gather clean linens, keeping him busy and out of the way. Dr. Thornton arrived shortly after and examined Gwendolyn. "Everything looks good," he said. "It will likely be several hours yet, but you are progressing well." Those several hours felt like an eternity to Drake, who paced the sitting room wearing a path in the floor. He could hear Gwendolyn's occasional cries of pain from the bedroom, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. Margaret came out periodically to update him, always with reassurances that everything was progressing normally. It was mid-afternoon when Drake heard the unmistakable cry of a newborn baby. He froze, his heart in his throat, waiting for some indication that Gwendolyn was all right. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Margaret emerged with a smile on her face. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is doing very well. Give us just a few more minutes to get her settled and then you can come in." A son. Drake sank into a chair, overwhelmed with relief and joy and terror all at once. He was a father. He had a son. Gwendolyn was all right. When Margaret finally allowed him into the bedroom, Drake found Gwendolyn propped up against pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had sewn. Drake approached slowly, reverently, as if he were witnessing something holy. "Come meet your son," Gwendolyn said softly, smiling at Drake with tired eyes. Drake sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. He had a shock of dark hair and a tiny, wrinkled face. As Drake watched, the baby opened his eyes, revealing them to be a deep blue that would likely change color in the coming weeks. "He is perfect," Drake whispered. "Gwendolyn, he is perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Drake nodded, and Gwendolyn carefully transferred the baby into his arms. The weight of his son, the warmth, the reality of this tiny person who was half him and half Gwendolyn, made tears stream down Drake's face. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I am your father, and I promise I will do everything in my power to keep you and your mother safe and happy." The baby made a small sound, and Drake looked up at Gwendolyn with wonder. "Did you hear that?" "I heard," Gwendolyn said, laughing. "I think he knows his father's voice already." "What should we name him?" Drake asked. They had discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Gwendolyn said, "What about Daniel, Daniel Brennan?" "Daniel," Drake repeated, trying it out. "Daniel Brennan, I like that. What made you think of it?" "It means God is my judge," Gwendolyn said. After everything we have been through, all the judgments people placed on us, I like the idea of naming him something that reminds us that only God's judgment matters. We are good people, Drake. We love each other, we built a good life, and now we have this beautiful child. Anyone who wants to judge us for how we got here can answer to a higher power. Drake leaned over and kissed her gently. Daniel it is. Our son, Daniel Brennan. Dr. Thornton and Margaret stayed for several more hours, making sure both Gwendolyn and the baby were stable and healthy. Dr. Thornton gave Drake instructions for the coming days and weeks, though Drake was so overwhelmed he could barely retain the information. Margaret promised to check in daily and to help with anything they needed. That first night, Drake barely slept. Every sound Daniel made had him instantly awake and alert. Gwendolyn, exhausted from childbirth, slept deeply when the baby slept. Drake held his son in the rocking chair, watching his tiny face in the moonlight streaming through the nursery window, and felt his heart expand with a love so profound it almost hurt. Word of Daniel's birth spread quickly through Apache Junction. The next day, visitors began arriving with gifts and congratulations. Mrs. Chen brought a beautiful embroidered baby blanket and a basket of food for Gwendolyn. The Morrison twins came by after school with a carved wooden horse they had made for Daniel. Even Mr. Grant, the gruff rancher, stopped by with a silver dollar for the baby's future. Gwendolyn recovered well from the birth, strong and healthy as she had predicted. Within 2 weeks, she was moving around normally, though Dr. Thornton cautioned her against doing too much too quickly. Drake, who had taken time away from his martial duties, hovered anxiously and tried to do everything for her. I had a baby, not a mortal injury, Gwendolyn finally told him, exasperated. I can wash dishes without collapsing. I know, I just want to help, Drake said. You are helping by taking care of Daniel while I do things around the house. That is more help than most husbands provide. Drake indeed threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything else in his life. He changed diapers, walked the floor with Daniel when he cried in the night, and spent hours simply holding his son and marveling at his existence. He proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle and utterly devoted. Daniel was a good baby, healthy and generally happy. He had Drake's gray eyes, which had changed from their newborn blue, and a temperament that seemed to be a blend of both parents. Calm and observant like Gwendolyn, but with Drake's intensity when something displeased him. By Christmas, Daniel was 6 weeks old and thriving. The little family celebrated quietly at home, with just Mrs. Chen and the Thorntons joining them for dinner. Gwendolyn looked around their cottage at the people gathered there, at the baby sleeping peacefully in his cradle, at Drake laughing at something Dr. Thornton said, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This time last year she had been alone and uncertain, new to Apache Junction and unsure of her future. Now she had a husband who loved her, a healthy son, a home, friends, and a place in the community. It was more than she had ever dared hope for. That evening, after their guests had left and Daniel was asleep, Drake and Gwendolyn sat together on their porch despite the winter chill. Drake had his arm around Gwendolyn and she was wrapped in a warm quilt. Happy? Drake asked, kissing the top of her head. More than I can express, Gwendolyn said. Sometimes I think about that day in the saloon when I grabbed that man's gun. If I had not done that, you might not have noticed me. We might never have met, not really. I would have noticed you, Drake said firmly. Maybe not that day, but eventually. You are impossible not to notice, Gwendolyn Brennan. When I wore that faded dress to our wedding, Gwendolyn continued softly, I was so nervous. I kept thinking about everything I had been through, all the ways life had been hard. I never thought I would wear white, Never thought I deserved something as pure and hopeful as a wedding dress." "You deserved that and so much more," Drake said. "But Mrs. Chen was right," Gwendolyn said. "The dress told my story. It had been through hardship, but it came out beautiful. Just like me, just like us." Drake tightened his arm around her. "Just like us," he agreed. "The years that followed were full and happy." Daniel grew into a bright, curious toddler, then an energetic child. When he was 2, Gwendolyn became pregnant again, and in the spring of 1881 they welcomed a daughter they named Grace. She had Gwendolyn's dark hair and sweet disposition, and Daniel was immediately protective of his baby sister. Gwendolyn returned to teaching when Grace was 6 months old, bringing both children with her to the schoolhouse. The students loved having the Marshals' children there, and Daniel eventually became a student in his mother's classroom. Drake continued his work as Marshal, gaining a reputation throughout the territory as a fair but firm lawman. The region became more settled and civilized under his watch, and Apache Junction grew from a rough frontier town into a respectable community with a real economy and infrastructure. In 1883, Gwendolyn gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named Samuel. He was a quiet baby who grew into a thoughtful child, happiest with a book in his hands. The cottage that had once seemed spacious enough for 2 became crowded with 5, and in 1884 Drake built an addition, adding 2 bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. The work took several months, with help from townspeople who had come to love the Brennan family. Mrs. Chen remained a constant presence in their lives, serving as surrogate grandmother to Daniel, Grace, and Samuel. She taught Gwendolyn more about Chinese cooking and herbal medicine, and in return, Gwendolyn helped her write letters to relatives back in China. When Mrs. Chen died peacefully in her sleep in 1886, the entire Brennan family mourned her deeply. Drake served as a pallbearer at her funeral, and Gwendolyn gave a eulogy that left no eye dry. The children grew. Daniel developed his father's sense of justice and his mother's teaching ability. By the time he was 15, he was helping younger students with their lessons and talking about becoming a teacher himself. Grace inherited her mother's gentle strength and her father's determination. She loved horses and spent hours helping Drake care for their animals. Samuel, bookish and quiet, surprised everyone by announcing at age 10 that he wanted to be a doctor like Dr. Thornton. Through it all, Drake and Gwendolyn's love for each other only deepened. They faced challenges together. Drought years when the garden failed, epidemics that threatened their children, the normal struggles of raising a family on the frontier. But they faced everything together, supporting each other, loving each other, building a life that was richer than either had dreamed possible. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Drake took Gwendolyn back to the site where they had married. The arch was long gone, but they stood in the same spot where they had exchanged vows, holding hands and remembering that day. "You ever regret it?" Drake asked. "Marrying me so quickly, building a life here?" Gwendolyn looked at him in surprise. "Regret it?" "Drake Brennan, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. This life we have built, our children, our home, all of it is more than I ever thought I would have." "When I saw you in that dress," Drake said softly, "on our wedding day looking so beautiful in that faded cream gown, I remember you whispered that you never thought you would wear white." "I remember," Gwendolyn said. "I am glad you did," Drake said. "I am glad you let yourself hope, let yourself believe you deserved happiness. Because you do, Gwendolyn. You always did." Gwendolyn kissed him, putting 10 years of love and partnership into that kiss. "We both did," she said, "and we found it together." They stood there for a long time, watching the sun set over the Superstition Mountains, casting the same orange and purple light they had seen so many times before. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of Apache Junction, now a thriving town of over 2,000 people. Their children were at home, Daniel watching his younger siblings, all of them safe and healthy and loved. The years continued to pass, bringing joy and sorrow in equal measure as life always does. Dr. Thornton died in 1890, and Margaret moved to Phoenix to live with her daughter. The Morrison twins grew up and started ranches of their own. The schoolhouse was expanded twice to accommodate the growing population of children. Daniel graduated from Teachers College in Phoenix and returned to Apache Junction to teach alongside his mother. Grace married a young rancher and had 3 children of her own, giving Drake and Gwendolyn grandchildren to dote on. Samuel went to medical school in San Francisco and then returned to take over Dr. Thornton's practice, serving the community his parents had helped build. Drake retired from being marshal in 1895 at the age of 43 after 17 years of service. He had made the territory safer, helped establish law and order across multiple settlements, and trained a generation of deputies and marshals. The territorial governor offered him a position in Phoenix, but Drake declined. His life was in Apache Junction, with Gwendolyn and their children and the community they loved. Gwendolyn continued teaching until 1898, when at the age of 43 she decided it was time to let younger teachers take over. She had educated hundreds of children over 20 years, and many of them came back to Apache Junction for a special celebration the town held in her honor. Former students, now adults with families of their own, shared stories of how Miss Torres, as they still called her, had changed their lives. In their retirement, Drake and Gwendolyn spent their days in quiet contentment. They tended a large garden, spoiled their grandchildren, and sat on their porch every evening watching the sunset. The cottage had been expanded and renovated several times over the years, but it was still fundamentally the same house Drake had surprised Gwendolyn with on their wedding night. One evening in the spring of 1900, as they celebrated 22 years of marriage, Gwendolyn pulled out the faded dress from the trunk where she had carefully stored it. It was now genuinely old, the fabric thin and delicate despite Mrs. Chen's expert restoration. "I cannot believe this dress," Gwendolyn said, holding it up. "It has been with me through so much." "It tells your story," Drake said, echoing Mrs. Chen's words from so long ago. "From desperate girl arriving in a dusty town to beloved wife and mother and teacher." "Our story," Gwendolyn corrected. "It tells our story, because everything good in my life started the day you walked into that saloon." They decided to donate the dress to the Territorial Historical Society, along with other artifacts from the early days of Apache Junction. It seemed fitting that their story should be preserved, that future generations might look at that cream-colored dress with its delicate embroidery and understand that it represented hope and transformation and the possibility of starting over. The new century brought changes to the Arizona Territory. Electricity came to Apache Junction in 1902. The railroad extended a line through the town in 1904, connecting it more directly to Phoenix and the wider world. Automobiles began appearing on the streets, strange mechanical contraptions that made the horses nervous. Through it all, Drake and Gwendolyn remained constants in the community. They were the elder statesmen now, the people younger residents came to for advice and wisdom. They attended every wedding, every funeral, every town celebration. Their children and grandchildren thrived around them, building lives of their own while remaining close to the family center that Drake and Gwendolyn had created. On a warm October evening in 1910, Drake and Gwendolyn sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were both 58 years old now, their hair gray and their faces lined with the years. But when Gwendolyn looked at Drake, she still saw the handsome deputy marshal who had offered her kindness when she had nothing. And when Drake looked at Gwendolyn, he still saw the brave young woman in the faded dress who had captured his heart. "Tell me about the first time you saw me," Gwendolyn said, as she had asked him to do many times over the years. It was their story, their beginning, and they never tired of remembering it. "You were standing in the saloon," Drake began, his voice still strong despite his years. "Holding that cowboy's gun like you had every right to be there. Your dress was dusty and faded, your hair was coming loose from its pins, and you looked terrified but determined. And I thought to myself, that is the bravest woman I have ever seen." "I thought you were going to arrest me," Gwendolyn said with a laugh. "I thought about kissing you," Drake admitted. "Right there in front of everyone. But that would have been highly inappropriate, so I settled for offering you a job interview instead." "Best decision you ever made," Gwendolyn teased. "Second best," Drake corrected. "The best decision was asking you to marry me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The town around them was quiet, settling in for the night. In the distance, they could hear Samuel's children playing in his yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "You think we did all right?" Gwendolyn asked softly. "With our lives, our children, everything." Drake took her hand, his fingers automatically finding the worn gold band he had placed there 32 years earlier. "I think we did better than all right," he said. "We loved each other, we raised good children, we served our community, and we built something that will last beyond us. What more could anyone ask for?" "What indeed?" Gwendolyn agreed, resting her head on Drake's shoulder. They remained there until full dark, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together in a harsh land, who had loved deeply and completely for over 3 decades. The faded dress that had brought them together was now in a museum, but its lesson remained. That hardship can lead to beauty, that new beginnings are always possible, and that love, real love, can transform everything. Inside their home, in a place of honor, hung the picture the Morrison twins had drawn all those years ago. 2 stick figures standing side by side, labeled Marshal Brennan and Miss Torres. It was crude and childish, but Drake and Gwendolyn treasured it more than any professional portrait. It represented the beginning, the hope, the promise of everything that was to come. Their story became part of Apache Junction's history, told and retold by the people who had witnessed it. The young woman who arrived with nothing but a faded dress and fierce determination. The deputy marshal who saw her courage and fell in love. The wedding where she wore cream instead of white and said with wonder, "I never thought I would wear white." The decades of love and partnership that followed. It was a story of the Old West, of survival and transformation, of justice and mercy, of hard work and faith. But most of all, it was a love story, the kind that reminds us that even in the hardest times, in the most unforgiving places, love can flourish and grow and create something beautiful that lasts for generations. Drake and Gwendolyn Brennan lived long lives, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. They died within months of each other in 1915, having been married for 33 years. The entire town of Apache Junction turned out for their funerals, and their children stood together, strong and united, a testament to the love that had created them. They were buried side by side in the Apache Junction Cemetery, under a simple stone that read, "Drake and Gwendolyn Brennan." They built a life together. No other words were needed. Their lives, their love, their legacy spoke for itself in the thriving community around them, in the children and grandchildren who carried on their values, in the memories of everyone who had known them. And somewhere, carefully preserved in a climate-controlled case in the Territorial Museum, hung a cream-colored dress with delicate embroidery. Visitors would stop to read the placard explaining its significance. The dress worn by one of Apache Junction's most beloved citizens at her wedding in 1878. Some visitors would pass by quickly, more interested in the guns and mining equipment. But others would pause, really looking at the dress, seeing the careful restoration, imagining the woman who wore it, the man who loved her, the life they built together. Those visitors understood that this faded dress represented something profound. The idea that our past, no matter how difficult, does not define our future. That we can be renewed, transformed, made beautiful again. That hope and love are always possible, even in the hardest circumstances. That the best stories are not about perfection, but about courage, resilience, and the willingness to begin again. The faded dress hung in the museum for decades, a silent witness to a love story that had captured the imagination of generations. And on still nights, when the wind blew down from the Superstition Mountains and through the streets of Apache Junction, old-timers would swear they could see two figures walking hand in hand through the town square. A tall man in a marshal's badge and a slender woman in a cream-colored dress. Forever young, forever in love, forever part of the story of the West. Their children ensured that the cottage where they had raised their family was preserved, eventually donating it to the Historical Society to become a museum dedicated to frontier family life. Visitors could walk through the rooms where the Brennan family had lived, see the cradle Drake had built for Daniel, the rocking chair where Gwendolyn had nursed her babies, the expanded kitchen where family dinners had been served for decades. In the main room, in a frame of honor, hung the Morrison twins' drawing, faded now but still precious. And next to it, a photograph taken on Drake and Gwendolyn's 25th wedding anniversary, the two of them standing in front of their cottage, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling at the camera with the comfortable ease of people who had weathered life's storms together and come through stronger for it. The legacy of Drake and Gwendolyn Brennan lived on not just in museums and historical records, but in the values they had instilled in their children and their community. Daniel became one of the most respected educators in the territory, eventually serving as superintendent of schools for the entire region. Grace's ranch became one of the most successful in Arizona, known for its fair treatment of workers and its innovative practices. Samuel's medical practice served the community for 40 years, and he trained a generation of doctors in the compassionate, thorough approach he had learned from his parents' example. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren spread across the Southwest, but many remained in Apache Junction, continuing the family tradition of service to the community. Teachers, doctors, ranchers, business owners, and yes, lawmen too, all descended from the union of Drake Brennan and Gwendolyn Torres. The story of the faded dress became something of a legend in Apache Junction and beyond. When young couples faced doubts about their worthiness for happiness, older relatives would tell them about Gwendolyn Torres, who arrived in town with nothing but a worn dress and built a beautiful life. When people struggled with shame over their past, they were reminded of how Gwendolyn had transformed her faded dress into something lovely for her wedding, how she had refused to let her hardships define her. The phrase, "I never thought I would wear white," became a kind of shorthand in Apache Junction for the idea that hope is always possible, that new beginnings can happen at any time, that no one is beyond redemption or transformation. It was whispered by brides preparing for their own weddings, by parents welcoming unexpected children, by people starting over after loss or failure. In 1950, on the 72nd anniversary of Drake and Gwendolyn's wedding, Apache Junction held a special celebration. By then, the town had grown into a small city, with paved streets and modern buildings. But the old-timers gathered to remember the early days, to tell stories of the deputy marshal and the teacher who had helped civilize the wild frontier. One of Drake and Gwendolyn's great-granddaughters, a young woman named Dorothy, stood before the crowd and told the story as she had heard it from her grandmother Grace. How Gwendolyn arrived alone and afraid, how Drake saw her courage, how they fell in love, how the wedding dress told a story of transformation and hope. "They remind us," Dorothy said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "that love is not about perfection. It is about seeing someone fully, past included, and choosing to build a future together anyway. My great-grandmother said she never thought she would wear white because she felt her past made her unworthy. But my great-grandfather knew the truth, that her past had made her strong, had shaped her into someone extraordinary. And together they built something that lasted, that continues to shape this community today." The crowd erupted in applause, and several elderly people wiped tears from their eyes, remembering Drake and Gwendolyn as they had known them, vital, loving, dedicated to each other and to their community. The celebration concluded with the unveiling of a statue in the town square. Drake and Gwendolyn standing side by side, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, her hand reaching up to clasp his. The sculptor had captured something essential about them, the sense of partnership and mutual support that had characterized their marriage. At the base of the statue was a simple plaque with Gwendolyn's famous words, "I never thought I would wear white." As the years passed, and Apache Junction continued to grow and change, the statue remained a constant, a reminder of the town's history and the values its founders had embodied. Young couples would have their wedding photos taken in front of it. Children would play around its base. Tourists would stop to read the plaque and learn the story. And always, somewhere, there would be someone facing their own fears about the future, their own doubts about whether they deserved happiness, their own struggles with a difficult past. And they would hear the story of Gwendolyn Torres, who arrived in Apache Junction with nothing but a faded dress, and left a legacy of love, service, and transformation that lasted for generations. They would learn that she said, "I never thought I would wear white," but that she had worn a beautiful cream dress anyway, that she had married a man who loved her completely, that she had built a life beyond her wildest dreams. And they would understand that if Gwendolyn could do it, if she could transform her life so completely, then maybe they could too. That is the power of a good love story after all, not just to entertain, but to inspire. Not just to make us feel good, but to make us believe that transformation is possible, that love can conquer fear, that new beginnings are always within reach, no matter what our past holds. And so the story of Drake Brennan and Gwendolyn Torres lived on, passed down through generations, adapted and retold but always maintaining its essential truth. That two people met in a dusty frontier town, recognized something precious in each other, and built a love that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations. The faded dress in the museum, the statue in the town square, the cottage preserved as a monument to frontier family life. All of these were just physical reminders of something intangible but powerful. The enduring truth that love, real love, can transform everything. That courage and kindness matter. That our past does not have to define our future. That hope is always justified, even in the hardest times. This was the legacy of Drake and Gwendolyn Brennan, cowboy and teacher, marshal and wife, father and mother, pillars of their community. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind something beautiful. What more could anyone ask of a life? What better story could be told? And so we leave them as they lived, together in love, forever part of the history of the American West, forever an example of what two people can build when they choose to see the best in each other and work together toward a common future. The faded dress told their story, but their lives, their love, their legacy wrote it in letters that would never fade, in a language that every generation could understand. The universal language of love, hope, and transformation.